Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here, and I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's Hammer Conversation with Frank Gehry, Esa-Pekka Salonen, and moderated by Nicolai Ouroussoff. So on to tonight's program. As you might imagine, I'm truly awed and honored to have these extraordinary guests here tonight, and on such an auspicious occasion. This month, the City of Los Angeles celebrates a really momentous work of art that's enhanced our city and our lives enormously. The Walt Disney Concert Hall opened its doors to the public 10 years ago in October of 2003. The geographic boundaries of the hall are Grand Avenue and Hope Street, and I think it's fair to say that it has even exceeded our grandest hopes for what it might bring to our community. In fact, it's radically reshaped the cultural landscape of Los Angeles, making downtown LA a true city center and catalyzing the astonishing artistic, civic, and social revitalization of the whole area. It's the home of the Los Angeles Philharmonic and the Los Angeles Master Chorale, and as soon as it opened, we knew we had one of the finest concert halls in the world, as well as an internationally recognized architectural landmark, embodying the unique energy and creative spirit of the city of Los Angeles and its orchestra. In addition to its beauty, Walt Disney Concert Hall is one of the most technically sophisticated concert halls in the world. While Frank Gehry was working on the architectural design, he stayed mindful of how musicians would experience the building, and thus the design of the hall and its acoustics evolved together. Gehry worked closely with expert acoustician Yasuhisa Toyoda and then LA Philharmonic music director Esa-Pekka Salonen to create the perfect instrument for the Los Angeles Philharmonic. And tonight we're privileged to have Frank Gehry and Esa-Pekka Salonen here to tell us in their own words how that creative collaboration worked. So just a brief background on our speakers. Frank Gehry received his Bachelor of Architecture from USC in 1954 and studied city planning at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. In subsequent years, he built an architectural career that has spanned 4 decades, producing public and private buildings in America, Europe, and Asia. His work has earned pretty much every of the most significant awards in the architectural field, including the Pritzker Prize, the Wolf Prize, the Premium Imperial, the National Medal of Arts, and the American Institute of Architects Gold Medal. Just a few of his many, many significant projects include the Guggenheim Museum Bilbao in Spain, the DZ Bank Building in Berlin, der Neue Zollhof in Düsseldorf, the National Nederlanden Building in Prague, the J. Pritzker Pavilion and BP Bridge in Millennium Park in Chicago, the IAC Building in New York, and of course, the Walt Disney Concert Hall here in Los Angeles. And I should mention, we're also honored to have Frank Gehry on the Hammer Museum's Board of Directors. Esa-Pekka Salonen is both a lauded composer and a world-renowned conductor with a restless urge for innovation that marks him as one of the most important artists in classical music. Salonen is currently the principal conductor and artistic advisor for London's Philharmonia Orchestra and the conductor laureate for the LA Philharmonic, where he was music director from 1992 until 2009. His pieces Floof and LA Variations have become established modern classics, and new compositions continue to be performed around the globe. Salonen's symphony Wing on Wing had its world premiere at Walt Disney Concert Hall in 2004 and was a gift from the composer to the LA Philharmonic in honor of their new home. As the music director of the LA Philharmonic for 17 years, Salonen is widely credited with revitalizing the organization and bringing the idea of the symphony orchestra into the 21st century. As Alex Ross of The New Yorker wrote, and I quote, "Salonen turned the Los Angeles Philharmonic into the most intellectually lively orchestra in America. The metamorphosis of the Philharmonic was Salonen's doing, and he thereby gained a place among the visionary conductors of American musical history." In addition to his work with the LA Philharmonic and the Philharmonia Orchestra, Salonen performs frequently as a guest with the world's top orchestras. He's also an enthusiastic conductor of operatic works and has had an extensive and hugely successful recording career. So we thought the perfect person to act as a moderator with these two artists is writer Nicolai Ouroussoff, who was on the ground throughout the narrative arc of the Walt Disney Concert Hall's genesis and construction. Nicolai Ouroussoff is a writer and critic who now lives in Los Angeles. From 1996 to 2004, he was the architecture critic of the LA Times, where he was a finalist for the Pritzker Prize in 2004. Previously, Ouroussoff was a freelance writer from 1992, and his work appeared in Art Forum, the New York Observer, Vanity Fair, Harper's Bazaar, the New York Times, and others. From 2004 to 2011, Ouroussoff was the architecture critic of the New York Times, where he wrote widely on architecture and urbanism in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, as well as the United States. He was a finalist for the Pritzker Prize again in 2006 and 2011. Nicolai is currently writing a book on architecture, culture, and politics over the last 100 years, which will be published by Farrer, Straus, and Giroux. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Frank Gehry, Esa-Pekka Salonen, and Nicolai Ouroussoff. Thank you.
Hello. Well, I want to start by just saying that I'm amazed that we're here. I'm amazed that it's 10 years since the hall is open. I'm kind of in a state of shock about it. It seems like it just opened yesterday. And given everything that people endured to see this thing built, and that we got to this point, it's one of, I think, the most positive stories that I've covered in my life as a critic. And I think that, to see the hall now as part of the fabric of the city is really remarkable to me. And I'm sitting with two people who are responsible for really making it part of the fabric of this city. So
we're both seamstresses.
right, exactly. Exactly.
That's a new one.
So I'm going to start with, I don't want to get into the whole history of the hall, which you all know, and how it got there, but I do want to start by asking both of you to talk about the ideas behind the hall. You were both there from the very beginning, and really about this idea of, I think both of you dealt with in very different ways, but to kind of shake the dust off of classical music in a way, and shake the dust off of architecture, but this idea of Disney Hall as a way that was really supposed to engage the contemporary world, popular culture, in a really kind of aggressive, direct way. And I think it's something that you kind of see continues with the LA Phil today. But it really started early on as an idea about what the building was supposed to be about, but also what the Philharmonic was supposed to be about. So I think that's something both of you can speak to if you want to take us back to that time, and what your visions were for what a concert hall should be.
Talk about Ernest. So I probably met Ernest before you did.
Most likely, yeah. Statistically speaking.
Just because you're older.
Yeah, so Ernest Fleischman, who's no longer with us, but he is with us somehow, taught me a lot about classical music over some years, and he wrote the program for this project, and his notes are now on a display at the Ernest Fleischman Gallery in the concert hall. If you get backstage and get there. But and he talked about his vision of a democratic, infinitely democratic room where people would everybody would be equal, that there would be no bad seats, that there would be intimacy and a feeling of together that most halls didn't have, and that Berlin started to address with Sharon. And he gave a pretty good menu of, to me anyway, of what was needed, and he was a harumph guy, he talked like so it scared the shit out of me.
He had an accent too.
Yeah, so I wasn't going to mess with him, and I believed in everything he was talking about, and he knew his business, and so I think that was the beginning of it for me.
For me, it was Ernest as well. It was back in '88 when he started to talk to me about coming to the Philharmonic on a permanent basis, and he came to see me. I was in Florence, I believe, and he was kind of explaining what it could be, and he painted quite a fascinating picture, of course. And then then he said, and by the way, we are in the process of building a new concert hall. And I thought that was a nice little icing on the cake. And if you think of the late 80s or mid 80s, the sheer idea of building a new concert hall in downtown LA, it was a totally utopian concept. And he was that kind of a person. That he sort of, that's what made him thrive, you know, when there was something really practically impossible and challenging and utopian. That's what he loved, and those were the things where he excelled. Wouldn't you agree? Yeah. So that's how I got involved, and then of course, you know, Ernst and I went to Frank's studio and looked at the various versions and incarnations of the design, and that was the beginning of the journey for me.
Well, I mean, you can't stop there. What were your first impressions of it when you saw it? Were you terrified, or were you ecstatic, or euphoric, or what was?
Well, at this point, I think there were like 12 different versions of it, and they were wildly different, all of them. And then there was
40.
Yeah, that's what I said. And then there was the design that won the competition, and the first thing Frank told me was that actually the hall is not going to be like that at all. So I had a little bit of
Well, they had a different acoustician. The acoustician that we finally got, who's sitting over there, I see him, Yasu Toyota. Hi. That and his partners, that changed it all. But when I won the competition, Ernest and I went to Berlin, because the model for all of us was Sharon's Hall. And if you know that, Sharon's greatest achievement as an architect, I think, was his humanity. And every building had it. Every one of his buildings had it. And it was a real, model of where we should all go as architects and building those places. And it didn't quite work, but it had that great feeling. So the acoustician for that hall was Lothar Kramer, who was in his 80s. He was what my age is now, so he was cranky like I am. And he came to dinner with Ernest and myself, and Dr. Toyota's elder partner, Dr. Nagata. And they both met each other, and Dr. Nagata said that Dr. Kramer was his hero and great teacher. And Dr. Kramer said that Dr. Nagata was his best student, and they were all wonderfully happy. And then I asked, so what shape should this hall be? And Dr. Kramer said, like that shape with the orchestra here. And Dr. Nagata said, that shape with the orchestra here. And so I said, well, which one? And I remember people throwing food at each other. I'm not sure that really happened.
Well, I was gonna get to the Berlin Philharmonic, and maybe we'll stick with it, and I'll come back to my other question. But you've played it, obviously, and it is an unusual hall because of the vineyard kind of configuration of it. There's seats all around. They kind of scoop down to the stage. It's very open. It's not a classical shoebox concert hall. What's it like to play it? Is it different? I mean, I know it from the architectural perspective.
Well, it's a great hall. It has got a beautiful sound, very sort of luminous, transparent sound, but also powerful. But it's kind of striking when you work in the hall is the lack of symmetry, because mostly concert halls are sort of identical, the two halves are identical, and then you know, as a conductor, you know where your nose should be pointing, i.e. towards between the first oboe and the first flute. That's the sort of way we stand, so that one eye is on each one. And in Berlin, it's somehow square.
Just slightly. It's an illusion in a way, because it's just slightly off.
It's not dramatically so, but enough that it kind of throws you a little bit. But the basic narrative of that hall is kind of new in the history of concert halls, which is about creating intimacy despite the volume. And in Berlin, when you perform on stage in Berlin, you really feel that nobody's very far away, and a large percentage of the audience is actually in front of you, which I must say at first is a little distracting sometimes, but then you get used to it, and then it becomes a great pleasure actually, because you realize that you are in the same space with all these people, and you're playing music for them, so it becomes more personal and sort of a social experience. And I think Sharon was the first one who figured this out, most likely.
We emulated that.
Well, you went to Berlin. I mean, Berlin was a kind of model for you for Disney Hall, right?
Yeah.
At the same time, the strange thing about Disney Hall, it's a kind of a hybrid in a way, because it's a kind of a shoebox and a kind of vineyard kind of layout. It's more focused, it's more compact. I think part of the idea was to make it even more intimate, right?
Yes.
It's also slightly smaller, I
But
think,
I also,
than Berlin, right?
On that trip, I visited the Concertgebouw with Ernest, and I found the feeling of that, the compression of that was more was interesting, and so it was a hybrid between those two. I made Disney symmetrical because I thought of it as a handrail, because I thought my architecture would be disorienting ultimately to normal people. And so I wanted to, I didn't want to do that. I wanted them to have something to feel comfortable with. And it wasn't a big deal to
find a way to work the two together.
No, because if you go to Berlin, there is a sound problem, because the symmetry, the asymmetrical, is stage right. So the seating goes up, and on the other side is the organ. So there is a sound disconnect, and some of the musicians told me they had problems with that, but I don't know if you experienced that.
I actually never used the organ in that space, so I don't know how it works there, but they do have a slight sort of I guess a sort of human scale problem, which is the size of the risers. Yeah. Because they're kind of too small for 3 desks and too large for 2 desks, so they have to sit rather uncomfortably. And of course, because this is the Berlin Philharmonie, the risers have been copied widely around the world. So we have, I'm sure, like 60 concert halls where the risers are not built for humans. I'm happy to report that the Disney Hall risers have been also copied now around the world, but they're perfect.
So can I tell them how that happened?
The risers? Now, you were working together at this point, or you were just getting to know each other at this point when you were talking through these kinds of questions, weren't you?
I don't remember. When I met him, he was 23 years old.
Go on. You were 30, right? Well, one of the key issues is how the orchestra sits. It may sound really kind of banal, but my experience is that the closer together they sit, the better it sounds. But of course, there must be a sort of a natural limit as to how close you can sit, because for various reasons. But the main reason is that everybody's physically active, and you have to have enough space to do all these movements that you have to do to produce the sound, and so on. And we started talking about this, and then Frank suggested we spend a couple of days testing this and seating the orchestra in different ways, and then kind of measuring it and marking it on the floor and measuring it, and then building mock-up risers that we can actually test in practical ways before they're being built. And this is what we did in Royce Hall back in
Royce Hall.
80
Now, I'm
something.
curious about that. I was going to come to this story later on, but I mean, this was you had been at the Chandler at this point, right? So it was a very particular experience there that, from what I understand from my conversations with Frank, it was kind of, there was a messiness or a sloppiness to the way the orchestra was organized at Chandler.
I looked at them and said, they're all over the place. And I asked him if that's the way it had to be, and he said,
And you said,
quite different, but
It's a human instinct, I guess, that if you have the space, you spread out in a collective.
well, the other thing is that the musicians are rugged individualists, and
Yes.
some of them know how to manipulate the stagehands better than others do. And so you find that over time tends to disarm. And when we did it at Royce and pulled them all together very tight, and the sound was the way he wanted it, we built those risers and took them to the Chandler. And the music critic at that time was very much against the Philharmonic and Ernest and everybody that had anything to do with it. And after the first concert on the new risers, he said, I don't know what happened, but the sound is better.
So the whole point was that we wanted to have risers that would, I wouldn't use the word force, but kind of suggest a certain type of proximity without being a sort of a fascist kind of thing, but so that it would attract people to sit close together rather than kind of lay down that law. Then, of course, we had a learning curve even after the mock risers had been built, because people kept sort of falling off the risers and stuff, and which is a little distracting in public performance situations. But then we sort of fine-tuned these things, built little lips here and there, and finally, I think what we have in the hall now is pretty close to the way it should be.
Yeah. It hasn't changed.
well, this touches on a different point to take us back just a little bit, which is you're both, in a way, fighting against a certain culture, I think. I don't know if you feel comfortable talking about this at the Philharmonic, the way it was when you got there, but you're obviously trying to change a culture, an existing culture when you got there, and the move from one hall, from the Chandler, to Disney Hall was a chance to reimagine it. Just like on Grand Avenue, I think part of the idea behind the hall, and I don't want to speak for you, Frank, but I think was trying to change the culture of the avenue too, which had always been this kind of, acropolis on the top of a hill where all the life happened at the bottom. How are you going to bring that life up there? How are you going to make it part of the city? How are you going to make it a kind of a people's hall, which the Chandler wasn't or was never perceived to be? So I guess we could start maybe with the culture you came into when you got there and what it was like.
Well, we have to kind of remember that this kind of culture, i.e. classical music, symphonic music, orchestras in this country, was basically a German export from the mid-19th century. And my feeling was that it somehow, in order to make it more integrated in the culture here, and especially in the contemporary culture, we have to kind of give it a slightly different narrative. So obviously we do care about the legacy, and it is a sort of a museum to some degree. But Deborah Boda coined this term that it's a museum with a very powerful and interesting and dynamic contemporary wing, and that was the kind of thing that wasn't completely simple to establish, because so many people had so got used to the idea of something being essentially a time warp from 1860 something. And I thought that if we get stuck in the 1860s, nothing against the 1860s, but if we get stuck there, this culture will soon come to an end. It will become like classic cars or something like that. You know, a bunch of nutty people collect them and have sort of congresses every summer in Utah or something like that. But
Right.
but my idea and dream, and I still believe in this, is that this kind of music should be a part of normal, integral part of everyday life, such as buying a milk or going to the gym or having a pint of beer or something like that. No better, no worse.
I have to ask you, just even though it takes a little bit off point, but do you see that also in terms of the music you compose and what you play at the hall and things like that? Because that's another aspect of it too. I know it's not strictly about the building, but it's about the culture you were trying to build there.
Well, of course, in the late 80s, early 90s, I started to think that instead of trying to impose this kind of old European Germanic model onto the musical culture in a place like LA, we should try to figure out what makes the LA Philharmonic unique, and what are the characteristics of the LA Philharmonic that LA needs, and that would be part of the LA story, and a sort of a Vienna Philharmonic implanted in the middle of downtown LA is not the answer in my opinion. So I started to think about ways to do this, and of course the key was the new hall, because I tend to use the word narrative a lot, I just realized, but it really changed the narrative. So all of a sudden we had an instrument with which to do all these things. And the Philharmonic and the hall became one. The orchestra and its instrument became one unit. And this was never the case with the previous hall, which was not bad. And it's a perfectly fine hall, but it was a different aesthetic. It was a different time. And it's a multi-purpose hall. And of course, Walt Disney Concert Hall is a fine-tuned instrument for one purpose, i.e. to be the instrument for high caliber orchestral playing from whatever century.
Mm-hmm. Well, Frank, I want to get you into I mean, you were fighting different battles, but related, and I'm just curious because in a way you're both you seem to be coming from different places, but I think in a way you're always coming from the same place. You're very close in sensibility. But there were a lot of battles you were fighting, obviously. One is the whole fundraising culture in LA to get the building built. We've talked about. But there's, more importantly, it was the idea of building a kind of a civic scale in the city and what that would be. And it doesn't have the history in terms of its civic architecture that New York does or Paris does or London does. I mean, in a funny way, the Music Center is the beginning of trying to build some kind of civic scale to the city.
I looked at those buildings as LA's insecurity, that they had to copy Lincoln Center and things like that. And LACMA's like that too. Pereira's office paid homage to Lincoln Center. Beckett did Lincoln Center. That was the model.
Mm-hmm.
That was the only model they had, and there was no brave. Nobody wanted to get out of that, and that was so strange for LA, where everything was freer.
Mm-hmm.
It was very disappointing, and we were stuck with that. We still have it.
Freer because there was this whole other history that was residential.
And so I was trying. I mean, I looked at the Chandler. It's without complaining too much about it, it's a box, and inside the box is all the stairways and all the stuff. So the scale of it was bigger. And so I was trying to break down the scale with Disney Hall into smaller pieces. And there was nothing to emulate, right, in the neighborhood. So it was sort of free. If you look at the shapes and everything, the amount of movement in the steel is just, I took the facade and tweaked it a little, but in 90 feet, it looks like a big deal.
Well, I'm going to dispute this in one way. I mean, I think most people often look at it and say that it's a building that doesn't relate to its context, but a lot of those, in a funny way, the building is a response to the Chandler Pavilion, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the way those curves work, they play off against the curves of the pavilion, so it is relating to its context.
Coming down, what's the name of the street I'm on? Grand Avenue?
Grand, yeah.
I forget where I am. As you come down Grand past the Chandler curves in, and so the Disney Hall opens to receive that visually. And on the Hope Street side, it does the same. So that entrance comes to the, what do you call it, the founder's room thing. So I was responding to the street and to the entrances.
And the history of the place.
Yeah, there was the box that the concert hall is in is a box, and it's raised on each end under the, so that, because we were going to put a hotel on the site, we were going to put all kinds of stuff on the site to begin with. And so in fact, there was going to be a chamber hall, there was going to be a lot of stuff jammed on that site. So the original building, the reason all the surfaces are sloped inward is to gain space. And finally we did. When Deborah came, thank God, she had the offices brought back to its proper place on the site, and Mrs. Disney's garden fetish brought the garden back, which I thought was great. It's just that we don't use it enough now, and we're talking about that kind of stuff now, about how to activate the relationship to the street, the relationship to the garden, and do something about creating an activity that supports the hall. But
why don't we talk a little bit about the hall itself now in a little more detail? Because, I mean, one of the things we've been talking about in a way is this relationship between freedom and control and what that balance is. Because you mentioned Berlin earlier on, both of you, and the looseness of it and how you came to a place that was more controlled. I mean, one of the issues, the kind of critical issues in terms of designing the hall was to keep private boxes out of it and to keep it as kind of open, where there was a kind of an egalitarian sense, right, of what the hall would be.
yeah.
I mean, does that come back to both your experiences of, well, first, what's your ideal hall besides Disney Hall, or the elements of it?
Come on.
Well, this is it. I mean, it changed not only did it change the story of the Philharmonic and the history of classical music in LA, but it has actually changed the idea of concert halls, period, in the world. Because something happened that was profoundly new and powerful and showed the way.
And it was on budget. I think if I asked how many people...
I knew you would bring this up.
Well, it just pisses me off. Everybody thinks it's... You know, I go to some of these talks and I say to people, do you think my building was on budget? And everybody says no. So
Well, it wasn't cheap, was it? But
it was cheap. It really was inexpensive compared to 3 or 4 other halls built the same size at the same time. we were about a third less.
There you go.
Well, I hate taking the heat for some. I mean, people say.
Let's go back to the founders' room too, because I thought that was also interesting, the way you had to deal with all the elements you had to deal with in terms of, because it is a kind of an ideal hall. There were so many different elements that had to be negotiated. I think some people don't understand how many things you have to negotiate to create something like that. I mean, the founders' room is interesting to me because you had to deal with the donors, right? You had to put them somewhere, because people who give a lot of money to a concert hall, when you're raising that kind of money, don't want to necessarily feel like they're just sitting in a seat like everybody else, right?
The hall is called the Food for Less something.
Right. Oh, that was an option. I remember
came
that.
back from Europe one time. I had been away for 4 weeks or something, as I'm driving from the airport, I see this sign, Food for Less Auditorium. And I thought, oh no.
No, I think the program was yearning for a chamber hall, because at that time Coburn wasn't built yet, and there wasn't a chamber hall in the vicinity. So Ernest always wanted a chamber hall, and so we didn't have the money to do a 600-700 seat chamber hall, although it was in the original program. And the foyer was a certain size to handle a certain number of people, and we needed a pre-concert thing, so we morphed it all into the foyer, and I designed it so you could actually take the pre-concert and with a few walls make it a chamber hall, but it's functioned very well for what it is. The only thing I'm disappointed is that we're not, and we're going to do something about it, that the foyer hasn't lived up to the hall yet. It's got to get some activity and places to.
What do you mean by that? Because of the way it's used, or?
I think it's the way it's designed with the bookstore and all that stuff. Anyway.
You mean it doesn't have the energy that the hall has?
And we wanted it to open up to the street. There's a very wide sidewalk, and so those doors are like garage doors. They open. You could open to the street, but the health department wouldn't let us because of rats. So I think the rats are gone now.
So you can do
curious.
it. But one of the things that happened in the hall, which I find as someone who's visited it a lot, is that it's not just that when you're conducting, you're looking at the audience, or some of the audience sometimes, but also that when you're in the audience, you're looking at other people in the audience, which is part of what the intimacy is about, right? Is that the audience has a kind of intimacy with other people in the audience and with you and the orchestra. So everyone is there's a closeness and a tightness in terms of the intimacy of it. I mean, is that something that, I think that's less true in Berlin, for example, because it opens up so much more.
Absolutely. What happens in Disney Hall is there's some kind of a feedback loop that gets established because of the intimacy. What happens to the orchestra and of course the conductor, that you realize that you're surrounded by people, you're in very close proximity, and there's a very close bond communication with everybody, and that in itself affects the playing, because musicians feel that, okay, now I'm not playing to some kind of anonymous collective who sits in a different space, like always happens in proscenium halls. You feel that I'm actually playing to individuals, people who receive this, they perceive it, and then they feel something and experience something. So it becomes a very different, more personal experience. And, it changed the way we approach things on many different levels, right? Musically, of course, but also, what kind of socks you wear and because everybody can see everybody, and musicians are usually not so precise with their wardrobe, but I would say there was a lot more focus after we moved into the hall. But that's just one layer of everything. But I think what happens is that then the orchestra is playing better, and it becomes more directed in a way in terms of whom we play to, and then the audience realizes that this is actually music for us and not just some kind of general activity, and then that somehow affects the way we then perform. So there's some kind of a communication, that wordless communication, that helps both parties. So it just amplifies and intensifies the experience for both performers and the audience. And this is very, very unique. And in no hall have I experienced it as strongly as in Disney Hall.
So the way we had a program for 2,500 seats, which was the original program, and our acousticians were saying that a 2,200 seat hall is the safest. As soon as you get larger, it gets a little more precarious. So I made two or three model that you could see what 2,500 seats looked like, and you could feel it. And then 2,200 seats. And the intimacy, I could feel it. You would have seen it. Mm-hmm. In the model was clear. And so I convinced Ernest to let me build a 2,200 seat hall and squeeze as many seats in as I could instead of building the larger hall. We got to 2,385, and so everybody was happy. Then Ernest retired, and they brought in a guy from Holland who was 6'6" as the new executive director. And he sat in the seating mock-up, and his feet hit. So he took out 2 rows. So that's why we're down to 2,265.
Back to short people again.
So that's the story, and
the three of us fit very comfortably.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, we never thought about these things for some reason.
No, but if very tall people ask for seats, there are seats, so they're given priority over the wider rows. I heard. I've never tried it out. But
This was an acoustical question too, obviously, right? In terms of the shape of the hall. I mean, one of the things.
No, it's what he explained, the intimacy. I mean, that you feel in. I mean, it's a little difficult here talking to this audience. We're not as. If we were in Disney Hall right now, we would feel this audience, but there's a separation here.
And also, it's about the physicality of the sound, how we experience it. Yeah. Because in most concert halls, big ones, you hear the music, but it never hits you in the stomach the way, say, heavy metal does. And I once went to an exhibition in Paris years ago. They had models of rooms where Mozart's symphonies had been premiered, and they were very small rooms usually, and the shape was such that I thought that even a small orchestra would make a hell of a racket, i.e. the sheer physical impact of that music was very, very strong. And then I started to think about the way he opened some of his symphonies, like the Hafner Symphony No. 35, which opens with sort of a very dramatic gesture and a sort of bold leaps and stuff. And I thought that if you hear this in a sort of acoustically physical milieu, then it really becomes incredibly effective and dramatic. Whereas in a normal concert hall, you hear the symphony, it sounds kind of cute. And I think that's the worst thing that can happen to music, that it sounds cute. That's the end of it. And what happens in Disney Hall, of course, is that because of the very powerful bass resonance, we don't only hear it, but we feel it. and I think that's really important for the overall experience. And that's one of the reasons why we have lost some ground to rock and pop music from this kind of music, the lack of physicality. And it's because of bad halls. It's just not loud enough. You know, that's simple. I can't believe I'm here saying that.
Yeah.
But quite often this is the problem. It's just not powerful enough. And when you go to a concert, that's what you want to experience. Some kind of overwhelming, emotional, physical experience. And the sort of physical thing is lacking quite often.
Well, there was a term I remember that was kicked around a lot just when the hall was opening, which was psychoacoustics, right? Do you buy it? Does that make any sense to you?
He thought I was nuts. That's why.
Is that why it came around? Yeah. Psychoacoustics?
No, I mean, we realized that I think Yasu knew this before, but there is a psychological aspect to it. For instance, the Disney Hall is, apart from the space and the feelings that Esa-Pekka just talked about, which are seriously important. If you go into a hall with a wood walls, you feel like you're closer to the violin, to the cello, to the sense of classical music. It's irrelevant acoustically. I mean, we actually did a scheme of Disney Hall in white plaster, and it was quite beautiful. It looked like big sails, boats, and stuff, and it would have worked just as well. But there were a lot of people that were worried about it psychologically, that they wanted the feeling of the warmth of the wood.
And the metaphor of an instrument really works when with the wood paneling.
Yeah.
So it really is a violin inside of a violin inside of a violin, and so on and so forth. And that's when it feels special.
So it's not to be discounted. It's a real issue.
Yeah. Now, can you tell us actually your experiences? Because I mean, one of the things about acoustics is you actually never know, no matter how much people think of it as a science, but no one ever really knows when a concert hall's done if the acoustics are going to be really beautiful or okay or not so good. There's still a kind of a mystery to it. What was your experience? I know I've heard your version of this, Frank. I'd like to hear both of them. What was it like when you kind of walked into the hall? I know with architects, for example, there's always a moment when you go into your building and you think, what the have I done, right? And then you go back, and there's a moment when you go, this is going to be all right, right? What was the moment for both of you when you walked into the hall? I don't know if you did it together or separately, and you started to understand what it was and that it would work or it wouldn't work.
It was a spontaneous event, actually, because Frank called me one night and said that we have to hear some music in the hall. And it was not finished yet. As a matter of fact, the stage was not there yet. There was just a big gaping hole.
Was it a panicky moment, Frank? Or
Well, no, I sort of visually calculated the amount of hard walls to space to absorption, and I got the feeling that we were, even though it wasn't finished, that balance was close to being there. So I called him up and said, could you come by the hall and could you bring a musical instrument? And by the way, so he brought Martin Schalfour, and we went to the hall and we sat up in the very highest seat. My son came with us, and Martin with a hard hat standing on a plank that was not the stage, because the stage wasn't there, started playing unaccompanied Bach, and I found myself holding Esa-Pekka's hand.
That was the most nerve-wracking moment. I mean, everything after that, the first second when the sound started coming out of the violin, and we realized that this is beautiful. It's just plain beautiful. And And after that, we knew that, okay, now
We're okay.
it's going to be a success, you know. We were fine. But up to that moment, I don't think I've ever been this nervous in my life.
Yeah.
Nice experience.
But then the first rehearsal, they didn't let anybody in, so I was there with Ernest and Deborah, I think, just 3 of us. And I knew about the bass thing, so I was looking at the first bass player and the first sounds, and he went like that, so I said, okay.
Yeah, there was a moment I think in the Beethoven's 7th Symphony, Allegretto, when the bassist played a pizzicato. And all of us, that was the first pizzicato they played in the new hall, in this closed rehearsal. And all of a sudden, this sort of resonant, deep sound came out of the bass section. And their faces, I'd never forget it as long as I live. The grin they had on their face was just unbelievable. And then, of course, after this test, many people were in tears. And, younger people were in tears for sheer excitement and all that. But some older musicians were in tears because one guy came to talk to me and said, I've wasted 4 decades of my life. And now it sounds like this, and I'm old, so isn't that unfair or what? But I said, look, look, you still can play several years here.
But in the first rehearsal, about 10 minutes into it, he stopped the music and he turned around and said, Frank, we'll keep it.
And we did.
This raises another, which is, if you could, there was also the question of the adjustments you had to make with the orchestra, right, to go from the Chandler to Disney Hall. What was that like, since the sound was so different? What kind of adjustments do you have to make as a conductor, as a music director? Also, because there was a sharpness to the hall, I think, as a complete Philistine. You could hear a pin drop in it in a way that I don't think you could.
Yeah. Of course, if you have got used to an idea of fighting an acoustical space every day for hours, and then you come to a space which is very responsive and sensitive and reacts incredibly beautifully. It's very hard to kind of recondition oneself from the concert moment when everybody is working beyond capacity physically to create some kind of sound that would carry into the audience. Whereas in Disney Hall, you can't do that. You cannot play against it. You have to play with it, and you have to trust the instrument actually carrying you and amplifying and deepening what you do. And that, of course, takes a while. It took a while for us to learn. And what happened, of course, was that after the first season, we came back after the bowl for the second season in the hall, and people said after the first rehearsal that, a lot of work has been done in the hall during the summer, clearly. And I said, no, nothing has been done. It was just that was the moment when somehow we had really started the process of reconditioning our minds and ears especially. And now, of course, it's a second nature for them after 10 years. But it didn't happen in a month. It took a couple of years, I think.
Wow.
And so for the first 2 years, when I went to a concert, and I always sat next to Deborah Borda, who we love, who's here somewhere and deserves a lot of credit for all of this. I saw everything that I should have done differently, and I saw everything that the stagehands and the lighting people and everybody was doing to screw it up. And I drove her nuts, so she moved my seat. But it took 2 years, I got over it.
And they let you back in?
Yeah. Now I don't care anymore.
Let's talk about, I mean, I think we've gone into a lot of detail about the hall. Let's talk about your own work and your personalities. I mean, you've become close to each other through this process. You know each other very well. And we've talked a bit about the way the hall itself is this kind of way of finding this balance between freedom and control. There's this kind of tightness to it and openness to it at the same time. And you know, Frank, I think often your work is understood as this kind of like, it has this exuberance. It's kind of open and free, but when you start to really look at it, there's a great deal of control and precision to it, obviously. Can you talk about kind of this in your own work, Esa-Pekka, and also just in your own life, too, both of you, how you've kind of struggled with this? I mean, you end up leaving the Phil, right, to work as a composer, which I think in some ways has something to do with that, right?
Yeah, of course. But I cannot imagine expression without structure, because chaos is not expressive, and expression for me comes through structure and certain type of precision. That it's not a sort of general activity like that of a sea lion. This kind of activity, but it needs a focus, and therefore Frank's work is a very great metaphor for me in terms of what works and what I believe in. Tremendous expression, very powerful narrative, a language which is identifiable from 100 miles away, and yet he says different things using this language every time with a new building. And there's this sort of balance of focus, structure, and expression, and that creates the illusion of freedom. Of course, there's no freedom in the arts, because we. I mean, that I don't think there is any, really. but when it's at its best, it creates an illusion of something just happening out of its own sort of spontaneity. And to get to that point, you have to be very structured, and that's exactly what Frank has been doing. And it for me, it's a sort of ideal, and I deeply admire his work in every way, but this, especially this aspect.
But you know that he grew up in Finland, and I grew up in Canada. And Canada, the shyness, I think it's mostly passive aggressive, but but it's there's like he talks about Finns look down at their shoes when they talk to somebody, but if they really like them, they look at their shoes.
Right.
So
It's kind of sad, isn't it?
I think that same kind of upbringing is I came from as well, and the I lived in northern Ontario, where the winters and the northern lights, and so the idea of wood for me was a powerful feeling of warmth and friendship, and I was raised on that. And then my first hero in architecture was Alvar Aalto from Finland, so whose work does that. So there's a lot of connection. I mean, you can't just pin it together, but there's a sense of that when in his work and my work that is, I feel, I don't know.
Well, you have a personal relationship to the hall, too, in a weird way. I mean, not in a weird way. I mean, in a very serious way, because you grew up near there at a moved not that far away from the hall, from the site of it, when you were a particularly tough time in your life, right?
Yep.
And music was very important to you in your private life, in your family life, as a way to kind of hold the family together in a way, as a sense of kind of this was the culture that was holding you together in a pretty rough time.
My sister played the harp.
Mm-hmm.
I used to carry it around for her.
But I mean, building the hall in a way, also in a personal way, was a kind of a triumph, I think, in terms of the way you've worked in the city, a certain idea of acceptance, and also something that was very
Well,
personal
maybe
to
things
you.
like this always happen as a miracle. I mean, if you just, when we first met, the idea that we'd be able to pull this off was far from our sense of possibility, right?
Yeah, and it also came to, several times it came to a halt. I mean,
Yeah.
as we perceived it. And
So we lived through a lot of tough.
there were at least 3 or 4 times when I said to Ernest that, okay, it's not going to be built and I should pack my bags because I failed and, you know, it's just not happening. And Ernest always said, well, you know, we'll persevere. And then it's here.
Yeah.
How do you started talking about this before a little bit, but if we could come back to it just for a second, is how did playing in the hall affect the way you see music? Or did the hall have an effect on you, a lasting effect in terms of anything, you know, in terms of how you see music, your own music, how you...
Well, I think the message of the hall is very, very encouraging for all of us, because for the last 20 years or so, there have been lots of doomsday predictions by various critics and cultural philosophers and so on and so forth about the demise of classical music and how this culture is outdated and it has no future and the audience is going to die away and goodbye. And what we learned was that it's just, you know, to play boring music boringly in bad concert halls, it sort of does it. but to have a sort of to have an instrument like Disney Hall that sends a message which is a contemporary message, and people can relate to it, then all of a sudden there is no problem. And you know, Mozart and Bach and Tchaikovsky and Stravinsky and Xenakis and John Adams all kind of coexist happily and dynamically in this milieu, and all of a sudden there is no problem. We are not talking about survival. We are talking about the next plan and the future and what can be done next and how should we develop this art form and so on and so forth. So globally, I would say the message of Walt Disney Concert Hall has been incredibly positive and encouraging and inspiring for everyone in the business.
I just want to end with one last question. My understanding is that after moving to London, that now you're coming back at least part of the time to LA, right? Is there something about
Couldn't
the
stay
hall
away.
that drags you back, or the city,
No.
or?
Well, it's home, really. That's what it is. So.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Well, I worked as a student intern for Ernest Fleischmann in 1973 for a year, and I can only support what you've said about how formidable it was to deal with that personality. I was 27. But my question has to do with the lobby issue that you raised, your concern. First of all, in the context of a tremendous triumph, what a great hall, what a marvelous experience we've had this decade, and thank you, the two of you, and Deborah Board and Ernest and everybody, the funders especially, for their wonderful work, yeah. But to focus on the issue of the lobby that you were concerned with, I've seen 3 of your halls, the New World Center, with the New World Symphony in Miami, Bilbao, and the Disney. And the other 2 halls strike me that there is a factor of light in those halls. First of all, the transparency of Bilbao, and also the whiteness of the walls and the pastel projections that give a brightness. Would you use light as one of your dimensions in dealing with your concerns about the lobby of the Disney?
Well, there are skylights in it, and there's. Yes, I said this the other day on something. Natural light is free, so we should use it. I think that the lobby, there was a lot of difficulty bringing this thing to fruition, and some of the things got sidelined. But now that this is great success, etc., it's time to relook at it, and I think we are. I don't know whether bringing light in from above. I forget where the light's coming from in there. I think what I see and what others, what Deborah and I are thinking about is that there should be more places to hang out, to sit and have a drink, to meet people in the lobby, and to figure out how to make that seamless with the restaurant and the outdoor spaces on Grand Avenue. The little cafe outdoor that we put there is a little bit sterile for me. We designed it, but I don't think it's in the right spirit. And now that the other side of Grand Avenue is being seriously contemplated, there's an opportunity for the developers over there to respond to something on our side. And so I've been talking to them, and there's, it's just in the incubation stage, so I can't, but those are the issues we're dealing with, to make it more active, more inviting, more usable on that outdoor space, so that it's more active with people going to the concerts, place to come early, stay late. And I'd also like to do more to activate the garden, Miss Lillian's garden upstairs, which could be used more than it is.
It's funny, just to add, I mean, that light plays a very subtle role that people don't always pick up on in the concert hall itself, because there are actually skylights in the corners, right, of the hall. So part of the issue with the compression is that it kind of pops open in a way at certain points, which I think stops the hall from becoming oppressive, even though you have all this tightness in it. So there's a lot of games going on with light, I think, in the building that if you look at it, yeah.
It's great.
Behind the audience. So, I mean, I think light is something that comes into the hall.
No, but I think that if you go behind the escalators, that's where you're talking about light, and that's where it's hard to cut a hole in to the natural light without cutting a hole in the founder's room, which maybe is a good idea.
Not a bad idea, I think.
Hi, I want to thank all of you, first of all. And I have a question directed at Mr. Gehry. When you spoke about your attempt to make it more egalitarian, I've grown up in this city, so I know that when the Temple of the Music Center was built and there was no Colburn, and it was my impression that when they built MoCA, the attempt was to keep it low so they could draw all the activity up to Grand Avenue, which was very sterile. And you seem to have taken the opposite approach. Did you feel that that was sort of unsuccessful, or was that changed when Colburn was built?
You mean that we lifted it up?
Right. That I thought that you said that you spoke to, there was a conversation with the music center, which was pretty much a sterile environment. And then
No, but the lobby is at street level. The foyer is at street level in our design, right?
Right, but my understanding of MoCA was that it was like built here, but it was also going down because of so much of humanity was below Grand Avenue. And is that sort of
No, I don't think that's why it went down. It was the developers pushed it down.
Well, the weird thing about Grand Avenue is nothing's on the street. Mocha's underground. The music center's up above ground.
Right.
I mean,
that was.
Yeah,
What-
no, we didn't want to do
Was
that.
was it an attempt then to sort of bring, rather than trying to go down to meet humanity, bring all of humanity up to Grand Avenue?
Well, the grand plan, but never got implemented, was that Grand Avenue from First Street to Mocha would be dealt with like a plaza. So it would be the same paving, the European method of well, what do you call those things?
which things?
Those things that block you from going.
Well,
Oh God, I forget words. I'm too.
the European thing?
You know the blocks that keep you from walking. Bollards,
Oh,
bollards,
bollards.
bollards. I got close, and that the landscape. There's no trees, and somebody passed the word that I forbid trees to be in front of Disney Hall, which isn't true. We were told that there was going to be a double row of trees on the east side of Grand, and that there would be no trees on the west side. So that was a given way back, because the Chandler was more sculptural, the plaza for the taper was more sculptural, and the buildings, the government buildings, were more banal, so they wanted more trees on that side. I think we got to revisit all of that. The reason, in fact, we had ideas for lighting the street. The fire department balked, the county balked, the CRA balked. I mean, we couldn't get anything done. By the time I was through, I was, like this. So I think we want to revisit all of that again. Maybe it's better times now. Maybe the city will and governmental agencies will help us make it an art street, because you got Mocha and you got Eli's building and you got Disney Hall, and it's a culture street, and it could express that. The street could be closed when the Philharmonic has a gala. We close the street and put a tent there. That could happen more often without having to bring a tent in. You could do it with lighting and paving and landscape but it needs the other side. Right now it's a parking garage. As soon as the new development happens, you'll have fancy restaurants and not so fancy. I hope they're not all going to be fancy, but they're going to be a combination. And the hotel is going to be more inviting to young people, and so I think.
Well, I guess the only thing I'd add is that, I think people forget that all of Bunker Hill was bulldozed now more than 50 years ago, right? I mean, there's nothing there. There's nothing underneath Grand Avenue. And it's still an incomplete project. They're huge lots that have never been touched, and nothing's been done on them since. So when you look at whether it works or it doesn't work, you have to remember that it's an unfinished project, too. I mean, there's a lot of, the violence of what happened. It takes a long time to kind of heal that kind of violence in a city. And one building's not going to do it all on its own.
This question is for Maestro Salonen. Considering the perfect acoustics in Disney Hall, next week I believe you're doing a world premiere of 200 Motels by Frank Zappa. And I assume this will involve some perhaps amplified instruments. I don't know. Is this simply the orchestral score? My question is, do you have to make adjustments?
Well, when you have an acoustical space which is this resonant and this sensitive, amplifying is not simple, and it was a problem in the beginning of the history of the hall for the first couple of years. But I think we have sorted it out, and since I left, they have developed it even further. So I'm not. Amplification is the least of the problems in the Zappa project.
Did you ever consider putting a bridge from the garden at Disney Hall over to the Music Center, or is there any thought of ever doing that at some point to join the whole complex?
We designed about 5 or 6 of them, going all different ways. I don't know what's happening with the Chandler now. They need a bigger backstage for the opera, and that would have to come out toward First Street to accomplish that. I know that's a dream and a wish they have. So there could be. Our original design has a bridge, the one we did for the competition.
Okay, well, I guess I want to thank both of you, not just for being here, but and thanks for being here.